Audubon County, Iowa, October 1882. The prairie wind had already begun to bite, a dry, ceaseless thing that carried the scent of frost and distant dust. It scoured the harvested cornfields, turning the stubble into a field of tiny, whispering knives. On a small rise overlooking the Nishnabotna River Valley, Axel Jurgensen was doing something no one had ever seen before. He was building a fort, not of sod or timber, but of hay. One by one, he hauled the heavy, wire-tied bales from the wagon his 2 oxen had pulled from the press yard in Exira. He wasn't stacking them in a neat, rectangular rick to be fed out over the winter. He was laying them like massive, fibrous bricks around the north, west, and east walls of his small, clapboard cabin, leaving a narrow walkway between the wood and the hay. The structure grew with methodical slowness, a great golden wall rising against the pale autumn sky. It was 6 feet thick, and he showed no signs of stopping as it passed the height of a man. The work was a spectacle. Neighbors on their way to town would rein in their horses, watching in silent disbelief. The consensus was swift and merciless. The man was a fool. "He's banking his house with the feed," muttered a farmer named Silas Croft, shaking his head. "Come February, his cattle will be chewing on the walls of his house, and his family will be chewing on their boots." The loudest voice belonged to Wesley Drummond. Drummond wasn't a farmer. He was a traveling hay press agent, a man who understood the science and commerce of cured grass better than anyone in 3 counties. He saw hay in terms of tonnage, moisture content, and market price. To him, what Jurgensen was doing was not just foolish, it was a perversion of good practice. Standing with a small crowd at the edge of Jurgensen's property, Drummond held court. "You see that?" he said, gesturing with a leather-gloved hand. "That's a 1,000-pound fire looking for a spark. He thinks he's building a wall, but he's building a funeral pyre." He lowered his voice, lending his pronouncement a grim authority. "The core of that stack will never cure. It'll hold the damp from the autumn rains, and by January, the heat from the decay will build. It'll combust from the inside out. He'll be lucky if it only takes the wall and not the cabin with it." The men nodded. They had all seen hayricks smolder and burst into flame. Drummond's logic was unassailable. Axel, hearing the commotion, paused his work. He stood atop the 12-foot wall of bales, a small, solid figure against the vast horizon. He looked down at the gathering, his face unreadable. "Mr. Jurgensen," Drummond called out, his voice full of confident pity, "that's a dangerous game you're playing with your winter hay." Axel Jurgensen simply looked at him, then at the northern sky where the clouds were gathering like a gray woolen blanket. He bent down, grabbed the sisal ropes he'd laid out, and continued his work, tying the alternating courses of bales together. The Danish madman was building his hay fort, and nothing, it seemed, was going to stop him. What did this quiet Danish halmtecker, this builder of thatch and bale, understand about cured grass and the physics of wind that a professional hay press agent and a county full of experienced prairie farmers had missed? The answer to that question would not be found in argument or debate. It would be written across the Iowa prairie by a winter so brutal it would be spoken of for generations, a winter that would test every assumption and break every convention. The story of Axel Jurgensen's hay wall is more than a curiosity. It's a lesson in how survival sometimes depends not on following the rules, but on remembering older, forgotten ones. I promise you, if you stay with me, you will learn something profound about the power of insulation, the behavior of wind, and how sometimes the most effective solutions are hidden in plain sight, dismissed as foolishness. If you've ever felt a draft in your own home and wondered where it was coming from, let me know in the comments below. The science behind Axel's wall might just surprise you. And be sure to subscribe because this channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of the pioneers who survived against all odds. Axel Jurgensen was not a farmer, not in the way his Iowa neighbors were. He hadn't been raised to the rhythm of corn, hogs, and open-range cattle. He was a man from the coast of Jutland in Denmark, a place where the land was a narrow negotiation between the sea and the sky. He was a halmtekker, a trade for which there was no direct English word. He was a master of thatch, of reed bundles, of rye straw walls, and of wind-cured grasses. His hands knew the language of compacted fiber, the precise tension of a binding knot, the exact angle at which a thatched roof could shed not just water, but the force of a Baltic northeasterly screaming across an exposed shore. His ancestors had built with the harvest for 1,000 years, not just feeding it to their animals, but living inside it, sheltered by it. When he arrived in Iowa with his wife Anya and their 2 small children, Lars and Sophia, he bought a plot of land with a standard-built clapboard house. It was considered a good house, tight for the prairie. The land agent had praised its construction. Axel, running his hand over the thin wooden walls, had remained silent. He knew wind, and he knew this house did not. Their first winter on the prairie was a lesson in a new kind of cold. It was not the damp, salty chill of the Danish coast. This was a dry, predatory cold that seemed to suck the warmth out of solid objects. It was a cold that found every nail hole, every gap in the window sashes, every imperfection in the foundation. The family lived in a state of perpetual siege. They burned through their woodpile at an astonishing rate, yet the cabin was never truly warm. At night, they would huddle together under every blanket they owned, but the cold would still creep in. The evidence of its victory was everywhere. One morning, Axel went out to the animals and found the iron band on the water trough had snapped, the metal contracting in the cold until the expanding ice within cracked it clean through. Inside the house, Anya noticed a strange phenomenon with their goose down comforter. The precious down, meant to provide loft and trap air, had migrated. The side of the comforter facing the outer wall was nearly flat, the down having shifted away from the cold, while the side facing the room was still puffy. The cold was a physical presence, exerting pressure on the very fill of their bedding. Even time itself seemed to slow down. The kitchen clock, a wedding gift from Anya's father, began to strike the hours an octave low, its metal components stiff and sluggish in the frigid air. Lars and Sophia were always cold. They slept in their coats. Anya was constantly chasing drafts, stuffing rags into cracks, her hands raw and chapped. Axel watched his family suffering with a quiet, burning resolve. He saw his neighbors facing the same struggle. They burned more wood, bought bigger stoves, and cursed the wind. They accepted this misery as the price of living on the prairie. Axel did not. He knew the problem wasn't the stove, and it wasn't the wood. The problem was the house itself. It was fighting the wrong battle. A conventional Iowa cabin was designed to contain heat. But the Iowa winter didn't just steal heat. It assaulted the structure with kinetic energy. The relentless 35-mile-per-hour wind was a physical force, a river of frigid air that flowed over and around the house. This constant flow was a process of forced convection. It stripped BTUs of heat from the outer surface of the wooden walls with ruthless efficiency. The wood, with an R value of about 1 per inch, was a poor resistor to this stripping action. For every degree the temperature dropped, the wind magnified the loss exponentially. A 0-degree Fahrenheit day felt like minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit on the skin of the house. The structure was hemorrhaging warmth. His neighbor's chickens stopped laying in December, their small bodies dedicating every calorie to simply surviving. Their cattle grew thin, shivering in the flimsy shelter of their lean-tos, burning through their own fat reserves just to stay alive. The sound of coughing was constant from the nearby cabins. The people of Audubon County were surviving, but they were not thriving. They were enduring. Axel looked out at his fields of harvested oat straw and the great stacks of hay he'd had pressed. He saw not animal feed. He saw not a fire hazard. He saw what his father and his grandfather had seen on the shores of the North Sea. He saw a building material. He saw the solution. The work began in earnest as soon as the last of the harvest was in. He chose the bales with care, selecting the densest, driest ones for his wall. He measured the perimeter of his cabin, leaving a 3-foot air gap, a space for the house to breathe and for him to walk. The rampart would stand on its own, a completely separate structure. He laid the first course on a foundation of flat stones to keep the bottom bales off the damp ground. The sheer scale of the project was what first drew the mockery. Each bale weighed nearly 80 pounds. He was moving tons of hay, not with a crew, but with his own back and a simple block and tackle rigged to an oak tree. The wall grew, a solid 6 feet thick. He laid the bales in alternating courses like a bricklayer, so the seams never lined up. This was crucial. It prevented wind from finding a direct path through the stack. Wesley Drummond, making his rounds, would often stop his wagon and watch, a wry smile on his face. He saw a farmer misusing his product, wasting a valuable commodity on a mad scheme. One afternoon, he couldn't resist. "Jurgensen," he called over, "you've got $2 a bale sitting in that wall. That's $100 of prime cattle feed you're turning into a mouse hotel." Axel paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at Drummond, then at the wall, which now stood 8 feet high. "It is for my family," he said, his English clipped and precise. "Not for the cattle." "Your family is going to be mighty cold when that pile catches fire from its own rot," Drummond countered, repeating his favorite theory. "You can't stack uncured hay that thick. It's a law of nature." "This hay is cured," Axel replied calmly, "and the wall will be dry." He turned back to his work, leaving Drummond sputtering to the other onlookers about the stubbornness of Danes. What Drummond didn't see was the subtle genius of the inner face of the wall. For the side facing his cabin, Axel had used bales of pure oat stubble, the driest, most porous material he had. Before stacking them, he'd left them out in the wind and sun for weeks, turning them daily. The outer layer of the stubble had cured to a glass-hard, almost shiny texture. This surface, facing the air gap next to the cabin, was designed to be hydrophobic, shedding any moisture that might condense in the space. He reached the full height of 12 feet, 2 feet above the eaves of his cabin's roof. The rampart enclosed the house on the north, west, and east sides, the directions of the prevailing winter winds. The south side he left open to the low winter sun. With the main structure complete, he spent a week meticulously tying it all together. He used heavy sisal rope, weaving it through the courses, cinching the entire mass into a monolithic unit. The wall was no longer a stack of individual bales. It was a single, 6-foot-thick entity. Anya watched from the kitchen window, her heart a mixture of fear and trust. The house was now perpetually in shadow, surrounded by this towering, sweet-smelling beast of a wall. "It feels like we are living at the bottom of a well," she told him one evening, her voice soft. Axel took her hands. They were warm. For the first time in months, they were truly warm, even without a fire roaring in the stove. "It is a quiet well," he said. "The wind does not shout down here." She looked at him, at the quiet confidence in his eyes, the same confidence he had when he'd thatch a roof that would last 40 years. She nodded. The mockery of the neighbors was a distant noise. The quiet in their home was real. The physics of Axel's hay wall operated on 2 principles that the prairie settlers, for all their hard-won experience, had failed to grasp: the power of trapped air and the mechanics of a windbreak. Wesley Drummond saw hay as a solid. Axel Jurgensen, the Halmtecker, knew that a bale of hay is mostly air. A standard bale of prairie hay, pressed to a density of about 16 pounds per cubic foot, is approximately 78% empty space. It's not the grass fibers themselves that insulate, it's the millions of tiny pockets of air trapped between them. Air is a fantastic insulator, but only if it's held still. This is the principle of insulation: to create a medium that stops air from moving. Moving air transfers heat through convection. Still air resists that transfer. Let's talk numbers. The measure of an insulator's effectiveness is its R value. A solid oak log has an R value of about 1 per inch of thickness. A typical 8-inch log wall, therefore, has an R value of R8. It's better than nothing, but against a relentless Iowa wind, it's a losing battle. Now consider the hay. Cured hay has an R value of roughly 1.5 per inch. Axel's wall was 6 feet thick. That's 72 inches. 72 inches multiplied by an R value of 1.5 equals an astonishing R108. Axel Jurgensen had wrapped his home in an insulating blanket with 13 times the thermal resistance of his neighbor's log house. The heat from his small stove didn't have to fight its way through a porous barrier. It was held gently within the cabin by a nearly impenetrable thermal shield. But this was only half of the equation. The R value addressed heat loss through conduction. The greater enemy was the wind, which stole heat through convection. This is where the second principle, the wind break, came into play. Axel's 12-foot-high rampart didn't just insulate his cabin. It created an entirely new microclimate around it. Out on the open prairie, the 35-mile-per-hour wind scoured every surface. A thermometer might read minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind chill on the north wall of a cabin would be equivalent to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. This extreme differential forced heat out of the wood at a catastrophic rate. But inside the cocoon of Axel's hay fort, the wind did not exist. The towering wall acted like a breakwater in a harbor. The hurricane of cold air hit the outer face of the hay wall and was forced up and over. In the 3-foot gap between the hay and the cabin, the air was almost perfectly still. The wind speed dropped from 35 miles per hour to nearly zero. This had a staggering effect. The outer walls of the clapboard cabin were no longer exposed to the wind chill. They were only exposed to the ambient air temperature within the sheltered gap. Furthermore, the massive hay wall itself acted as a thermal buffer. The sun would strike the top of the wall, and that tiny amount of heat, along with the geothermal heat rising from the ground, would be trapped in the enclosure. Measurements would later show that the surface of a cabin wall protected by such a rampart could be up to 22 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the wall of an identical cabin exposed to the open prairie, even when the ambient air temperature was the same. Axel had done more than just insulate his house. He had fundamentally changed its relationship with the environment. His house was no longer an object in the Iowa winter, it was an object apart from it. Wesley Drummond's fear of combustion was based on his experience with wet, green hay stacked for storage. Axel had used dry, cured hay, and the air gap he'd created allowed for ventilation, preventing any moisture buildup. He hadn't built a compost pile. He had engineered a high-performance, breathable wall system. He had stacked the summer harvest between his family and the wind. That winter, the prairie received its judgment. The old-timers called it the Iowa windburn. For 16 consecutive days in January, the temperature never rose above minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. And for those 16 days, the north wind never dropped below 35 miles per hour. It was a horizontal blizzard without snow, a relentless scouring of everything that stood above the frozen earth. The existing snow was blasted from the fields and packed into drifts as hard as stone against every fence post, every barn, every windward wall. The county descended into a state of quiet, desperate war against the cold. The sound of axes echoed in the frozen air as men began to dismantle sheds, fences, and even wagons for firewood. Smoke poured from every chimney, a frantic offering to the god of warmth. But the offering was not enough. Inside the conventional cabins, the battle was being lost. Water froze in buckets just a few feet from roaring stoves. Windows were opaque with a thick layer of interior ice. Families abandoned their main rooms and huddled in the kitchen, the one space they could hope to keep above freezing. Silas Croft, the man who had mocked Axel's use of feed, lost a third of his cattle, the animals freezing where they stood in their drafty lean-to. But at the Jurgensen home, a strange peace reigned. Outside, the wind howled, a high, thin shriek, as it passed over the top of the hay rampart. But it was a distant sound, like hearing a storm from deep within a cave. Inside the small gap between the hay and the house, the air was still. There were no drafts, none. The windows had a delicate filigree of frost in the corners, but the panes were clear. The domestic warmth was proven in the smallest details. Anya could knead bread on the kitchen table, a simple act that was impossible in her neighbors' homes, where the cold drafts would form a hard, unworkable crust on the dough. The children, Lars and Sophia, played on the floor in their woolen socks, not their coats. The kitchen clock struck the hours with a clear, resonant chime. The goose-down comforter remained full and fluffy on all sides. Axel fed the stove with a placid economy, using less than a quarter of the wood his neighbors were burning through. They were not just surviving, they were living. The most undeniable proof came from the small henhouse Axel had cleverly wedged into the lee of the cabin, tucked under the overhang of the rampart on the protected south side. Every morning, Anya would go out into the still, cold air of their enclosure and return with 3 brown eggs. The hens, sheltered from the wind and benefiting from the radiated heat of the house and the wall, were comfortable enough to keep laying. All across Audubon County, every other chicken had quit in December. Those 3 brown eggs, laid fresh each dawn in the heart of the windburn, were a daily miracle. A quiet testament to the fact that the crazy Dane had been right. The vindication, when it came, was not sought by Axel. It arrived, as most frontier justice does, on the back of misfortune. On the 10th day of the windburn, Wesley Drummond and his 2-man hay press team were on the section road a half-mile from Jurgensen's farm when the frozen iron axle of their heavy wagon snapped with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. The situation was dire. The sun was a pale, useless wafer in the sky. The wind was a physical blade cutting through their heavy coats. To stay out in the open was to risk freezing. Drummond knew they had minutes, not hours. The nearest shelter was the Jurgensen place. Cursing his luck, he led his men, half running, half stumbling, toward the strange golden fortress he had so publicly ridiculed. They didn't even try for the door on the south side. They collapsed against the west wall of the hay rampart, huddling in its lee, gasping for breath in the brutal cold. The hay blocked the wind completely. The sudden stillness was a shock to the system. But something else was happening, something Drummond's mind couldn't immediately process. He was leaning his back and head against the tightly packed bales, expecting to feel a deep, piercing cold soak through his coat. He felt nothing. It wasn't warm, but it was a profound absence of cold. It was like leaning against a wall in a room, not a stack of hay in a blizzard. Shivering, he pressed his face into the tiny gap between 2 bales. The air smelled sweet and dry. There was no wind. He pulled off his thick wool hat, his scalp instantly prickling in the frigid air. He hesitantly leaned his bare head back against the straw, and then he felt it. It was the moment his certainty shattered. The straw didn't suck the heat from his skin. Instead, he felt the faint, unmistakable sensation of his own body heat radiating back at him. The wall was acting like a mirror for warmth. It was reflecting his own life force back to him. He pressed the palm of his bare hand flat against the bales. He had handled hay his entire life. He knew its textures, its temperatures. He expected the feeling of frozen, brittle fibers. What he felt was a dry, neutral surface that felt no colder than the wood of his own desk. He stood there, dumbfounded, his hand flat against the wall that shouldn't work. That should be a block of ice. It was in that moment that the door to the cabin opened, and Axel Jurgensen stepped out into the sheltered walkway. He saw the three men huddled against his wall in the broken wagon on the road. He held a steaming coffee pot in his hand. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply walked over. "The axle?" he asked. Drummond could only nod, his voice lost in the wind. "Come inside," Axel said. "We will fix it when the wind dies." He led them into the cabin. The wave of calm, steady warmth that enveloped them was so complete, it felt like stepping into another season. Drummond's men stared, slack-jawed, at the children playing on the floor. Drummond looked from the small, placid stove to the clear windows, to the loaf of bread rising on the table. He looked at Axel Jurgensen, this quiet man he had called a fool. "How?" Drummond finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Your wall? It's not cold." Axel handed him a cup of coffee. "The wall is not for the cold," he said simply. "It is for the wind. The wind is the thief. I stopped the thief. The cold is lazy. It stays outside if you do not let the wind carry it in." Drummond looked down into his coffee cup, then back at the Danish farmer. The simple metaphor struck him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't built a fortress. He had built a trap for the stillness. He had stacked the summer against the winter. Wesley Drummond was a salesman, but he was an honest one. What he had witnessed at Axel Jurgensen's farm fundamentally changed him. He spent 2 days there, waiting for the wind to break. In that time, he did not just accept Axel's hospitality, he became his student. He listened as Axel explained the principle of the still air, the alternating courses, the importance of the dry core. He walked the perimeter, touching the wall, feeling the profound difference between the violent chaos on one side and the absolute calm on the other. When the wind finally subsided and Axel helped him and his men repair the axle with timber from his woodpile, Drummond shook the Dane's hand with a new and profound respect. "Mr. Jurgensen," he said, "what you've done here, people need to know this." Drummond was true to his word. He completely rewrote his Indianola to Sioux City sales route. At every farm, at every grange hall, at every press yard where he demonstrated his hay baling machinery, he spent half his time not talking about his press, but talking about the Jurgensen wall. He described the broken axle, the brutal wind, and the impossible warmth of the cabin. He sketched the design in the dirt with a stick, the 6-foot thickness, the 12-foot height, the air gap, the open southern face. At first, the farmers were as skeptical of him as they had been of Axel. But Drummond had a credibility Axel, the outsider, had lacked. He was the hay expert, and his story was not theory. It was a first-hand account of survival. The proof of the 3 brown eggs laid every day through the windburn became a legend. That spring, a few brave families tried it. They built smaller, less ambitious versions, but they followed the core principles. The following winter, a milder one, they discovered the astonishing fuel savings. The word spread like wildfire. The technique didn't need a patent or a publication. It spread through the most reliable frontier network, results. By the autumn of 1883, Wesley Drummond had incorporated the idea directly into his business model. He was no longer just selling a machine that made bales, he was selling a system for survival. 47 of his new hay press contracts included a winter fort rebate clause, offering a discount to any farmer who committed to using a portion of their bales to build a Jurgensen-style rampart. He had turned Axel's folk wisdom into a replicable, commercial technology. The hay fort went from being a mark of madness to a sign of savvy preparation. The simple idea, born on the windy coast of Denmark and proven in the crucible of an Iowa winter, became part of the architectural language of the prairie for a generation, saving countless cords of wood, untold numbers of livestock, and, undoubtedly, human lives. What Axel Jurgensen built may seem primitive to modern eyes, a relic of a bygone era, but the principles he applied are more relevant today than ever. His 6-foot thick wall of hay was, in essence, a form of super insulation. His meticulous focus on stopping air movement anticipated the modern building science concept of the air barrier, now considered one of the most critical components of an energy-efficient home. The entire concept of straw bale construction, a growing movement in sustainable and green building, owes its lineage to pioneers like Axel, who saw not waste, but a resource. He created a passive, high-performance structure decades before terms like passive house or net zero would ever be coined. In the end, the story of the hay fort is a powerful reminder of a recurring theme on the frontier. The prairie did not reward credentials, status, or conventional wisdom. It was a harsh and impartial judge. It rewarded what worked. Axel Jurgensen didn't try to persuade his neighbors with arguments or win their approval with words. He didn't lay a wall of stone to fight the winter. He simply stacked the harvest between his family and the wind, creating a small pocket of stillness and warmth in the midst of the storm. He trusted that reality, in its own time, would be the only argument that mattered. And on the unforgiving plains of 19th century Iowa, reality always had the final say. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found this piece of lost history as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten ingenuity. And let us know in the comments. What modern problem do you think could be solved by looking at an old, forgotten technique? We'd love to hear your thoughts. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. It is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by real historical practices and principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative license. Any application of historical building techniques in a modern context should be done in consultation with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.